Thanks very much again for the invitation to come and speak to everyone. And can I also acknowledge my parliamentary colleague David Morris, the Shadow Minister for Local Government, who's here today. And to all of you, I know some have come. I know Glenelg's come from 4.5 hours away. So I did say to Anita, is it quicker to come to Adelaide or to Melbourne? And she said it's halfway. I think she's being polite to me in saying it's probably quicker to Adelaide, but I'm glad to see Glenelg here, so thanks for coming. And thank you to everyone. As you know, in about 8 months' time, we'll be at the time for a state election. This must be the best time for councils. I keep thinking, how good would this be? You're about to come into a budget 8 months from a state election. I hope you put in ambit claims. I hope you went in and said, we want, dual track, high speed electrified trains to Orbost again. And yeah, it's a great idea. East Gippsland says go for it. And Glenelg, you should be asking for an international airport. This is the time. In reality, as I said, this is going to be an election that will be tight, that will be seat by seat, that all of us will have a lot of attention, irrespective of being in what has been traditionally safe territory for Liberal, Labor, National and Independent seat, whatever. And that's a good thing. It means that there'll be a lot of attention, particularly on areas outside of Melbourne. And the last time I came to speak to yourselves, I talked a lot about population and decentralisation. And without blowing my so's own trumpet, we've been talking about population for 2.5 years, which is why we established the Victorian Population Task Force. The concept of growing Victoria the same way in the next 30 years as we have for the last 30 years is not sustainable. And I hear a lot of people coming up with great grand plans and ideas about how we can do this and ship everyone off, and it's not going to be an easy or a short-term task. But the reality is governments have to think differently about the way we manage our state's growth. Last week, there were Australian Bureau of Statistics population figures again, and I noticed Victoria at 146,000 annually. That is our annualised growth. They are figures that we could never have dreamed of. Less than a decade and a half ago, it wasn't even 46,000. Now it's 146,000 across the whole state. But what's concerning is that 128,000 of that is happening in and around the Melbourne metropolitan area, with another 6,500 going to Greater Geelong. And that is the raw data coming out of the ABS. That's 92% of the state's growth happening in the Port Phillip Bay Basin area, which is utterly unsustainable. Let me put it this way to you. The City of Wyndham, one council in one growth area of Melbourne, is growing numerically faster than the entirety of the Adelaide metropolitan area, our 5th largest city. The City of Wyndham alone. That's not to take in the City of Whittlesea. That's not to look at pressures still being faced by Casey and what it takes to provide schooling and transportation and all of the above amenities to service that population. It is enormous, and it is a great challenge that our state is facing, which I say again is why we established the Population Task Force, soon to report in its final incarnation. And what it says, and I say again to this room, is that we need to do business differently as a state. Words alone won't change our population growth. But what we need to provide are those incentives. And it must be a partnership between state and local government. One level of government alone won't fix what is a problem for our state. The growth isn't, the disparity in where that growth going is. Melbourne alone can't sustain the level of growth that we're seeing exponentially year on year of 130,000 near every year. And so I've noted again in a number of your budget submissions and looking again at this year's, the plan for a Minister for Rural Communities, with again the concept being about how do we provide that amenity growth, how do we provide a seat at a cabinet table for rural communities. It's very easy for state governments to see decentralisation through the prism of Geelong, Ballarat and Bendigo, and that's it. And then say, well, what goes beyond that, we can't control, we can't do anything about. That's not true. My plan for a Minister for Decentralisation complements the Minister for Rural Communities, and I'm happy to look at wording around titles. But what I want to do is to provide a seat at the Cabinet table, whether it's a transport brief, a planning brief, on everything that is coming into Cabinet, about how we are providing incentives and what kind of government expenditure is happening outside of Melbourne to provide an incentive. You won't have an incentive to people to move to regional towns or country towns if the level of healthcare or education service is so behind what you get in a growth area of Melbourne that it is indeed a disadvantage. We all know that. We all know that if people have to drive 40 kilometres to avail, as one of my friends does, a special school for a child with special needs, that is no incentive to move outside of Melbourne. And so it becomes having a seat at the cabinet table is so important to providing the incentive and having a government that is focused on decentralising our population and our economy. And again, when I look at the lease of the port, which was effectively 60% plus used by country and regional Victoria, the fact that not even 10% of those funds, despite bills being passed into Parliament saying it should, not even 10%, not even 5% of that funding has gone back to country and regional communities, I would think is an insult. We have to do better, whomever wins the next election, to regionalise and decentralise our population growth. Simply saying that we have a regional development minister who has 5 other portfolios, I might add, in one part of one portfolio in one government for one person is not enough. It's not enough. Whether we have to look at targets to grow outside of Victoria, we have 12% of growth happening outside of Melbourne and Geelong now, whether that's 20% by 2025, 30% by 2030, and providing government incentives to get on with the job, to get whether it's taxation tiered systems, whether it's, as I've said before, transport incentives, whether we look at how we're marketing, as I've said to this room before, all of our regional communities, so that there's a consistency for the first time around how we're marketing regional and rural communities when we're marketing our state externally. That kind of job can only be done by a state government. Again, I give this room a commitment. My focus, should we come to government, is to decentralise our state's population, not just for many of your community's benefits, but for Melbourne as well. Melbourne can't sustain the growth that is happening in our growth areas today. It is not good for a city to be accommodating the growth levels that we are today, everything focused on a state in one city. It's not good enough that government says, for the last 30 years, we say, well, we're just going to become a city-state and everything's got to be connected back into Melbourne. Our incentive needs to be to grow all of Victoria. When my family came to Australia, they went to the Latrobe Valley. There were jobs. There was a community that had been established. Many went to Shepparton. Many overseas communities went to Western Victoria. That is not the case anymore. As Melbourne receives the vast bulk of overseas migration, an even more disproportionate number of those are coming to live in Melbourne and not regional Victoria. And that's why a Minister for Decentralisation or a Minister for Rural Communities is going to be so important to shift that debate beyond Geelong, Ballarat, Bendigo into how we're going to grow our entire state. When I go to country Victoria, I always try and take the train where I can. I know I'll come to Western Victoria, but where I can. I was at the train to Shepparton on the weekend, and also during the week I've been on the train to Warrnambool. I think I've been to Bairnsdale, Albury, which is as an effort, and I'll come to that as well. The simple fact is the lifeline for our state's connectivity has got to be heavy rail, whether it is freight and whether it is passenger movements. It's why one of our key focuses, and my key focuses, has been not to talk about the year 2025, 2030 and what might come after that, but in our first budget, to begin providing $640 million, which is necessary to replace those V-line diesel-hauled services that came in under, or began coming in under the Hamer government. The Hamer government. I'd only just started primary school. And they're still running around today. And they're not a bad service, but they're worn out and they're tired. And if we want to decentralise our population, we have to provide faster, more reliable, a better quality and a better standard of service to country Victoria. And that $640 million replaces all of our diesel-hauled long-haul trains on the Bairnsdale, standard gauge to Albury, the Shepparton, the Swan Hill and the Warrnambool lines. It puts in velocity long-haul trains which both have first class and economy, as they do now, has a buffet, as they do now, has a conductor, as they do now, but of course has a lighter frame and can run at 160 kilometres an hour as opposed to 115 on the regional fast rail network. And yes, there will need to be track upgrades to accompany those trains to bring them up to a better speed than what is the current 95 kilometres an hour from Murchison East to Mooroopna, for instance, or 85 kilometres an hour from Kerrang to Swan Hill, as I found out over January. We need to do better in providing a level of country trains and country transport to country Victoria. And we can't expect, as I said before, a population to have incentives and businesses to grow if the level of trunk transportation is substandard. And that's what will be part of our first budget, should we come to government at the end of this year, to upgrade that service. And not just around trains, of course, around our road network. And yep, there's a lot of debate about, again, roads in Melbourne, whether it's the East-West Link, the North-East Link, the Western Distributor. And they're needed debates, and they're essential debates, I understand that. But of course, for those politicians who dare venture outside of the CBD and maybe even a bit west of Ceres and Geelong, you'll come across some of the worst roads in our state in the southwest, where signs have been erected, as many of you will know, to say this road is soon to be upgraded. They've got the effort to erect a sign to say it's going to be upgraded, but no effort to actually fix the road. And the removal of that country roads and bridges funding on those localised roads, again, as I found out through travelling in the southwest and up in the northwest recently, has been catastrophic for councils. And I've made commitments the last time I was here, and I restate again today, about reinstating, whether it is the Country Roads and Bridges Fund or a similar form, to ensure that councils have that level of funding matched by state government to provide basic level of infrastructure that they need to provide. It can't be provided by councils alone, and it can't be a space ignored by the government. The replacement program, we found there were roads being funded in Mulgrave out of a country roads fund, a country roads infrastructure fund. And the argument was that, well, trucks coming from the country use those roads, which is ludicrous and insulting. We need to do better when it comes to providing that direct level of funding. And again, on a first budget that I might be able to bring down, should there be a change of government at the end of the year, our commitment is to have a similar fund or a reinstated form of the Country Roads and Bridges that will provide councils with the funding that they need and the level of certainty that they need to be able to upgrade their local roads as they had in the past. When I was in Mooroopna last week, I was speaking to a number of shop owners around some of the law and order issues that they were facing in that town. And not to single out Mooroopna, but I happened to be there. And I've found this from Gippsland to the northeast, to the northwest, and even in the southwest, particularly in relation to ice and some of the impacts it is having in our country towns and in some of the regional cities as well. And while law and order issues in Melbourne, particularly in relation to whether it's carjacking or home invasion, may not be relevant in country and regional Victoria, ice-related crime is certainly concerning and in some areas is enormous. And yes, I've committed plans, a bail plan to give police stronger powers of veto over bail, for instance, and a one-strike bail. If you offend on bail, you go back to jail and so forth. To tighten up our parole system, similar to the reviews post-Marcia Vukotic's murder, and of course to introduce mandatory minimum sentencing on 11 key offences against the person. But what is terribly important, I think, in relation to ice-related crime is to ensure that we have a tough but compassionate approach for mandatory rehabilitation, and particularly for people under 18. And that policy, which I recently launched, $30 million, 36 beds, facility, which would be the first instance and the first trial, would be focused on helping those families, particularly many in country and regional Victoria, who are at their wits' end, who are finding ice crime in some of these smaller communities is out of control, and they don't know what they can do about it as a community or indeed as repeat offenders in some of these smaller towns. And so the mandatory rehabilitation for those under age 18 is certainly new. It hasn't been trialled in Australia, but it is a tough but fair approach. It's a tough but compassionate approach, and it gives communities hope that it's not just about a punitive measure and about putting people behind bars. It's also about helping some of these kids get off and being aided deliberately to get off drugs before it becomes a lifetime of addiction and leaves them with no future. And we're finding much of this crime is occurring in country and regional Victoria where it is disproportionate. And so we hope this facility, should we be able to put it into practice, will have a clear focus built in a peri-urban area, will have a clear focus on helping a number of individuals and areas which have got ICE-related crime more than ever before. In energy supply, again, when I spoke to you later last year, I think it was in September, we talked around the issue of natural gas and opening up some of those natural gas supplies. It has now become evident more than ever before that Victoria needs to be self-sufficient when it comes to our electricity grid as well. You know, when I see the plans, when you see the national marketer, for instance, looking at, well, we're going to oversupply, we're going to have to switch off places. They never switch off an outer suburb of Melbourne. It's always, well, what part of country Victoria is going to get switched off? And so while the drawdown is coming out of the outer burbs of Melbourne, the penalty is being applied to many parts of the country. Our state's got to be sustainable when it comes to electricity generation. And my view, and our policies soon to come out on electricity supply, are that we need to be self-sufficient. And whether it's on renewables, whether it's reinvesting in existing technology, we need to increase our power, our megawatt supply here in Victoria than what we have today. Simply relying on Tasmania and New South Wales is not a long-term approach. It is not something that the government can excuse itself from. It is not an area of, both in terms of cost, both in terms of supply, that we simply just vacate for the sake of saying, well, there's nothing else we can do about this. There's plenty we can do about this. And providing a greater level of supply into the system, into the grid, is so important, particularly when I go down to the southwest and three-phase power and upgrades like that have been overlooked, but now they face power outages when it comes to hot days, for instance, on supply. And while we're at it, ladies and gentlemen, I think that there's one issue in the last couple of weeks that's bobbed its head again in Melbourne that has never left country and regional Victoria, and that is around the Country Fire Authority. And some people might have different views, but let me tell you mine. I'm a politician, I like telling people my point of view. Never before have our Country Fire Authority volunteers, and indeed the paid staff, but the institution, needed support, needed backing, needed people to stand up with them. And I've been very proud to say that I believe that we need to stand up for our Country Fire Authority. And whether it's a paid employee of the Country Fire Authority or one of the 55,000, 60,000 volunteers, they need a government that stands behind them. And I want to make sure that if we come to government that we enshrine the rights of all of those in the CFA, particularly the volunteers, into any enterprise bargaining agreement negotiation. That we have once and for all a Royal Commission to match what had been done in the past around the structure and indeed the operation of our Country Fire Authority to make it the best in Australia, but without smashing it up, without trashing what has been a great brand for our country communities, an organisation that binds many country communities together, that in fact, like Men's Sheds, brings many people on the weekends together in a way that church might have done 30 or 40 years ago. And so we have to stand by, in my view, Country Fire Authorities around the state, and that is something I'm absolutely and utterly committed to doing. I just want to conclude where I started, ladies and gentlemen. Never before has Victoria faced a population challenge like we do today. Never before has it been so important that we see realistic and ambitious goals set for how we grow our state into the future. Simply saying that we can build a couple of roads in Melbourne and throw a bit of money here and there with whomever is in government, that is not going to fix what is a fundamental problem for our state. Growth is always a good thing. Unplanned growth is not. Growth only happening in one area is not. Sharing the growth helps all of us. Confining the growth to one area helps only a few. Victoria has to look at lessons from governments of the past, and that requires more government intervention than ever before, whether it is around relocating government operations, whether it is around taxation incentives, whether it is investing in country rail like never before, whether it is investing in country roads in a way that we haven't done recently. All of these things need to come together under a plan to decentralise our state. I've grown up in Melbourne my entire life. I've never seen Melbourne so unlivable as it is today. When I was growing up, I used to think how magnificent it would be for Melbourne to be the largest city in Australia again. Well, I tell you what, Sydney can have it. I don't think any of us here in Melbourne want that anymore. I don't think we want to be that. And frankly, Melbourne's about to become that much earlier than everyone's ever said. And I know you've had a lot of presenters talk to you about population. I'll leave you with this fact. Every statistic that we've produced around population growth in the last 25 years for Victoria has been wrong. Every one of them. Even the high-end ABS forecasts, they've all been wrong. According to Melbourne at 5 million, we're about to hit 5 million in the year 2030. We're about to hit 5 million in the year 2020. According to the documents from the 1990s, Victoria's population would hit 6 million in the mid-2020s. We're about to hit 7 million in the mid-2020s. And according to a number of the Victoria in Future figures, Melbourne's share of population growth wouldn't rise much above 80% for any of that time. It's never dipped below 88%, and added with Geelong above around 92%. So the challenge we face is real, it is getting worse, and we need to rethink totally the way we are trying to grow our whole state. We can argue over law and order, energy, transport, all of these issues, and they're legitimate issues. But the kind of Victoria we lead to our children and grandchildren is the most important of the lot. And if we leave a Victoria that is just a great big city-state, a great heaving city of 6 million people in a population of 7 million in the whole state, that is not a good one. And so my focus and my commitment, should I become a Premier at the end of the year, is to have a government that is utterly committed at every level to change the way we do business. And it can't be through a combative approach. It has to be with councils and with the federal government, whatever form that is, into the future. Because we have to change the way Victoria is growing. It is not sustainable to have a Melbourne where the suburbs go out beyond Narnagoon, or a Victoria where 94% of the growth is happening in one area. It's not going to be a sustainable Victoria. And with that challenge comes opportunities for many of your communities. Many opportunities. Opportunities that I think many of your communities have wanted for a long period of time. And that's why, while I joke at the start and say it's budget time, it's coming into an election, if we want to give those incentives to people and business to relocate, then the first stages is going to need to be providing adequate levels of incentive, not just financial and taxation and housing price, but lifestyle. And that can only be availed by a government that is utterly focused to increasing service delivery and infrastructure in areas where we want people to move. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for the invitation today. I'm more than happy to take some questions. Thanks again for your time.
Thank you, Matthew. And one of the joys of being a chairperson, you get the first bite of the cherry. So I have three. I'll put them all together. Railway line to the west, further west than Ararat to Horsham. That's one question. New South Wales have allocated their $4 billion plus sale of the Snowy scheme to rural and regional New South Wales. If you were elected, what is the position? And the other one, recycling is a big issue at the moment. There's approximately 600 million sitting in a slush fund. And again, what would be your decision on utilising that with the problems we're having recycling? So sorry to hit you with three, but I only wanted one go.
Chairman takes his rights, doesn't he? Rob, rural rail lines, Emma Keeley has seen us a number of times, as has Louise Staley, about what we might be able to do beyond Ararat. It's fair to say we'll be talking to you fairly shortly, I think, but the concept of the need to be a change at Ararat, there'd be a change of trains because you've got standard gauge up to, or broad gauge to Ararat. Standard gauge is a change station beyond Ararat if you went from Stawell to Horsham. and again, standard gauge if you ran down towards Hamilton and even if you ran down towards Portland, for instance. And while I won't give a specific policy today, I will say this. It is my absolute belief that one of the key indicators to communities that governments want to invest in them and want them to grow is when it hinges around the operation of a passenger rail service. When people see that a link that has been there, whether they use it or not, and this concept that the Department of Treasury and Finance have that every rail line must make money or it should close is wrong. It needs to be, in many instances, a service that is provided to country communities that gives them confidence that the government is willing to provide a service to them so that they know there must be something that the government, there must be a reason to do this and there must be a reason to reinstate it. So again, while I don't want to give you a specific announcement today, my view is that heavy rail and the reintroduction of it, even if it means a changing of train at Ararat, for instance, or at another location, is not a hindrance and should not be a policy negative when it means reinstating country passenger rail services. All right, you had two others, didn't you? Snowy. Well, we've allocated, we'd forecast that sale, allocated part of that, so it would go to a broader level of some infrastructure. Some of that would be in Melbourne, and we haven't allocated all of it. Some of it would also fund our Country Trains initiative, $630 million. So we've kind of mixed that around and to country and to city. Recycling, there is the, I forgot the name of the fund that sits there for a couple of $100 million that seems to, the Sustainability Fund. David Morris knows all about it. No, from government, you'd know all about it. And it sits there kind of used by Treasury and Finance for everything else but sustainability. I spoke to the Chinese Consul General yesterday about this, and they were putting it in a language, we used to export these goods to China and then they would just manufacture them and do what they do. And the attitude was that, you are sending us material that is now marking us down on international environmental regulations. We cop it. You send it to us. We have to do something with it. We put out the carbon dioxide emissions. We pay the penalty. It's their side of the story. Our side of the story is, of course, we have a lot of recycled material that is now either going to go to landfill in some councils or is going to sit in warehouse or be warehoused in effect, until something's going to be able to do with it. Like in Australia, it's classic with Australia. We value add nothing. There is material here that if some of that fund was used, could be value added and exported and then either make us more money in return or indeed for a little bit of investment could actually be useful to local economies rather than just being seen as a dumping problem. So I think, to be completely frank, around the whole recycling initiative Australia needs, and Victoria maybe, needs a mindset change around, rather than just either digging it up and shipping it overseas, or in this case, collecting it from houses and shipping it overseas. If we use some of the taxes we avail from it, we might be able to value add and do something far more productive with that material rather than just sending it offshore and hoping it's someone else's problem. One. Oh, I shouldn't. I've got to get the boss to do it.
Hey, you're not supposed to support Western Victoria, Oh, thank you.
Robert Vance from the Pyrenees Shire. At the start of your address, I almost thought I heard music to my ears. If elected, you will appoint a rural communities minister, was that correct?
I said that my commitment was a Minister for Decentralisation, which I gather from looking at your material is literally a very similar thing to what my commitment for a Minister for Decentralisation is. I want that word decentralisation in whatever title it is, because it sends a very clear signal, not just to the public, but to the public service about the kind of government attitude that now exists around decentralisation and moving things to country and regional Victoria. My fear is that another form on title becomes lost in the government speak that exists in throughout the sphere of government, politicians included.
Yeah, I just think from Rural Council Victoria's perspective, if we've got somebody that we can talk to in government, we can go and talk to ministers now, but they have dual roles to perform. And if we've got a specific minister that has decentralisation as their portfolio, makes our approaches a lot easier, I believe. Thank you.
Agreed. Back to Western Victoria.
He's not a very long speaker.
Rob knows me too well, I think. Richard Hicks from West Wimmera Shire Council. Mr. Guy, thank you very much for your presentation. I have a couple of issues that I'd like to perhaps ask you to expand upon. I think with today's seminar, we've talked around the issues of connectivity, which has various aspects. One is obviously mobile phones, internet, but also access to public transport, which you've already dealt with, upgrade of necessary rural roads, and things like the main highways. Of course, of interest to us is the duplication of the Western Highway out through Horsham and beyond. I'm interested to know what you might intend to do with reducing the number of black spots that are of obvious concern to us, and how you might reallocate funding towards the upgrade of a lot of these rural roads, which are in a really terrible state of disrepair.
Yeah, and that part of the commitment that or discussion I had last time I was here was certainly around the country roads and bridges, but also a broader package focusing around some of those country black spot areas, which the member for Polwarth, Richard Reardon, has raised with me many times, and going out towards, further out towards your way and Conniva and Edenhope, for instance. Some of the roads that are off the main highway are now going south, where there are a number of black spots there which haven't seen either matched funding or what had previously been federal or state black spot funding in the past. Part of our country roads initiative, which again I don't want to release today, does have quite a clear focus around black spot funding, because I think a lot of that has been overlooked for the bigger projects in the last decade or so in this state.
Could I just remind you also about telecommunications?
Telcos. I must say, I'll have to abscond that to Mitch Fifield, the federal minister. The state doesn't usually have any control over telcos, although Anita was telling me about the NBN in Portland, which doesn't sound too flash, so I'm more than happy to take that up with Mitch Fifield.
Further? Yep.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks. We've dealt with... Sorry, Don Firth, Benalla Rural City. Just with regards to recycling is a problem that we all have to deal with in the moment, and everybody will do it in their own way. However, I believe that one of the greatest problems that we've got in local government in the country is waste management in general. I'm just wondering whether or not you've got any insights into what your government would do if elected with regards to EPA levies and so forth.
Look, not specifically, but I would agree with you on one key point. It's not just about waste management through local government, it is waste management in general. I think we've had a very dated approach to waste management. New South Wales is now looking at waste to energy technology, which is being sponsored by the state government. You're now seeing waste, recycled goods, for instance, being put or used as food waste, and others being put on trains and sent out to the Blue Mountains to be used for waste to energy schemes being trialled. I mean, we've done none of this in Victoria. We've had plenty of suggestions and not much in the way of actually achieving any results. So while that's certainly being looked at the moment by David Southwick, there's nothing we've announced to date. But I would say again, the Sustainability Fund needs to be used for sustainability purposes. And part of that can be how we're using waste to energy, how the government's treating waste to energy, and the concepts of using it for the first time in Victoria, when New South Wales, and I think even South Australia is now trialling it as well, is something we've never done. And yet the opportunities around, we kind of have never embraced at a state level ever before in Victoria.
Any further?
One down the front. One over there.
You've mentioned all the other lines. Oh, sorry, anything that's from Tasby Shire.
Yep.
Just the railway line from Echuca to Bendigo, so our students can attend university, live at home, we may not lose them. What have you got in mind for Echuca?
The most important thing on the Echuca-Bendigo line would be appropriate track work to get that train travelling beyond 70 kilometres an hour. Well, it's travelling at 70 or 75 in most sections. You know, you can't have an interurban rail service operating at sub 100 kilometre an hour speeds. It is not an incentive whatsoever. And the disincentive to it is, I've travelled on literally every country rail passenger line in the state, Swan Hill, Albury, I've travelled on all of them. The only one I've not travelled on is Bendigo to Echuca, and that's because I don't know I could tolerate sitting at that speed for that long, watching every car fly past me. And that's the truth. There's a perfect example. I'd rather drive it. And yet I'll get the train to Swan Hill, which is 4.5 hours. I think I got it from Gisborne. It was about 4.25 hours. And so the most important thing we can do there is invest in track, and track works outside of the regional rail network is the most, second to rolling stock, is the most important aspect. It's not signalling, it's track work. Further in, it might be signalling. The edge of the network, it is track speed and track work and track condition. And that line is perfect. That's the most important one in the state. If we're trying to encourage tourists to come out of Southern Cross, potentially off airport rail, apparently it's going to be built by anyone, listening in the last couple of years, but to have tourists to get the train up to a major tourist destination that is Echuca, that is not an incentive. The bus is quicker, and yet from Bendigo to Melbourne the train manages 160 kilometres an hour, and then it's less than half that speed for the second half of the journey. It's completely crazy. Track work.
Coming from both ways.
Thank you.
Just yell.
On?
Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you, Mr. Guy. Bob Hon, Mitchell Shire. I have an issue in regard to freight rail that's coming from Brisbane through to Melbourne, and I'm just wondering if elected, how your government is going to support those smaller towns that this is going to roll through, you say, at all hours of the night, whatever, and with the work and infrastructure. I'm just wondering whether those smaller towns, as it enters into that growth areas, how are we going to support
Well,
them?
freight rail will be standard gauge, so it's ARTC, so it's the National Rail Network. The reality is that we'll have to look at appropriate noise attenuation and other measures, because we can't hinder our rail network operation. It's going to increase in its operation. So my only point would be that we'll have to look at, and I know you see a lot of that on the line through Wallen, for instance, nowadays. We'll have to look at how we manage that growth with what is going to be, and is going to continue to be, an expanding patronage along that line of freight rail. And yes, they're big, and yes, they're noisy, but we have to encourage more freight back onto the rail network, the standard gauge ARTC rail network. So that will require, obviously, whether it's planning regs, local government support on some of the noise attenuation. Some of that can be achieved through vegetation, so it doesn't need to be a great big ugly wall, which we've done in the past in plenty of areas, and particularly in the Southeast Growth Corridor. So there's a number of ways, but we'll have to look at it through that level rather than trying to manage, if you like, the growth on the standard gauge line.
Our concerns are probably a little bit higher up than the Wallen area.
Yep.
Because Broadford, 3 bridges that are going to have to be pulled apart and made bigger.
Yeah.
How that's going to affect the town.
Yeah, I must say I wasn't aware of that, but whatever we need to do to focus on, firstly, the track condition, which I know the feds are saying that they're now going to address, north of Mangalore, and then south through Mitchell, down Seymour, Broadford, Kilmore East. Again, this is our main trunk line, and we're going to have to, whether it's partner with the feds and the state, because it will be beyond the council, to improve some of those bridges, then I'm happy to have a look at that, but we'll need to do that because we need to funnel more than we can back onto our national rail network.
Yeah, 2%, it's a bridge too far.
That's probably right.
One last question.
Thanks, Mr. Guy. Mark Reeves, Deputy Mayor, East Gippsland Shire. Thank you very much for sharing your vision here this afternoon.
That's right.
I'm sure a lot of what you said had resonance for many of us. In my notes, I wrote down, you used the term, if you're elected, there'll be more government intervention. Mm-hmm. And I just wonder if this is an existential question about the great Liberal Party ideal. does that mean to control the growth of Melbourne, there'll be more intervention in land sales, land releases, rezoning, planning and the like? How do you physically stop Melbourne growing and squeeze people out into areas such as we're governing for?
One of the things we will have to do in terms of focusing on decentralisation will also be planning for it. And that will mean a greater level of support, particularly for councils like yours around, say, Bairnsdale and going further westward to Traralgon, the Valley, Warragul-Druin, whether it's support for a greater level of city planning or urban planning or structure planning, if you like, around those councils as to where that growth is going to go. You know, we can't grow Warragul-Druin exponentially onto great farmland, which it has. Magnificent dairy country. We can't just keep saying, oh, well, we'll just build houses over that as opposed to build houses on Nanagoon. So there has to become a sensible debate about which towns are going to grow, where their boundaries are going to be, and how councils can manage their growth. It's my view that the Victorian Planning Authority should conclude all of its structure planning work by June 30, 2020. Then the VPA should focus and have its priorities refocused to supporting councils to manage that kind of growth and manage that kind of structure planning. I don't necessarily want the minister to be making a decision on where we have to grow and how we're going to do it. I want that, as it has in the past, to come from the councils, and whether it's through your MSS or whether it's through your current structure planning work. And in many cases, most councils have got their indicative boundaries set as to where they're going to go and how they're going to grow, and whether it's industrial, whether it's residential, which towns will have greater density, what are their greatest pressure points, and so forth. That should be formalised and agreed with the state government through regional growth plans, and if necessary, a Plan Melbourne, the equivalent of, for a Geelong or a Traralgon or a Bairnsdale, which then puts it in stone and says, this is how the town's going to grow. This is where it's going to grow. And if that support is necessary through government intervention and the VPA, I'll make it available. If it means a flying squad needs to be re-established to support, I'll reinstate it. But the only way to do that is to provide that level of support to make this kind of planning certainty happen. Otherwise, it will be sporadic, it will be haphazard, and it will not work. You'll repeat the same problems in country and regional Victoria that we have in Melbourne, and I don't want to do that, which is why the Minister for Decentralisation would need to come either to Cabinet or to a ministerial colleague through an interdepartmental brief to seek that support for councils that have asked for it. And particularly those along, and forgive me for harping on about it, particularly those on heavy rail lines where you want to actually be able to use them as either a commuter or a transport belt, then they will need to have a greater level of planning support availed to them. That's where the state and councils must work together. It won't work if you have a different priority to the state and vice versa.
Ladies and gentlemen, could you please thank Matthew?